Hi, everybody. Welcome to Recovery Connection. If you're joining us today, you were supposed to be seeing this yesterday, but we had some technical difficulties. So you're looking at the recording today, which we actually did last night. So this would be technically pre-recorded, as they say, right? So welcome to the Recovery Connection, episode number 12. Today we have a very special guest, Christopher Adam from St. Joe's Supper Table. And we'll introduce Chris in a second. Welcome. Sorry for the mix-up. We'll get it straightened out. Hopefully this doesn't happen again, but I'm sure it will. Our mission here at the Recovery Connection is to connect and educate organizations, people in recovery, viewers, and the vast resources that have gone under the radar in this city of ours. And there's a lot of them, and that's why we're doing this. So we're glad that you're here. Join us live on Facebook when we normally do this at the right time and it's not pre-recorded. The second and fourth Tuesday of every month, where I will be here and I'll be chatting with friends like Christopher and community organizations. And we're going to be talking about stuff that's important to us, stuff that we need to talk about, right? Stuff that has gone under the radar for a while. And so if you're joining us, thank you for being here. And remember that the podcast version will be on Spotify and all your streaming platforms next Thursday after John does his wonderful magic and cleans up the recording and takes out all my hums and haws and hiccups and coughs and tapping on the tables. And yeah, he does a wonderful job. So tonight I have my buddy Christopher Adam from St. Joe's Parish. Thank you for being here, Chris. I want to start off with St. Joe's Supper Table, who you are, what you do there.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. So St. Joe's Supper Table is a ministry of St. Joe's Parish. I'm the executive director of the parish itself.
Yeah.
And the Supper Table is one of our programs. I've been the director of the parish now for about 10 years.
10 years.
10 years.
Isn't that the limit for executive directors in ministry? Hey, something I heard. I don't know. But
I'm hearing that more and more now that I'm at the decade mark. I wasn't sure when I first got this job that I'd be here 10 years later, but I still am.
Well, we all say that.
We all say that. Yeah, absolutely. And it does, it grows on you. And then, your life moves in a direction that I think is often harmonious with the work that you do. So it affects every aspect of your life. I started off as a parishioner, as a student, actually, graduate student at St. Joe's Parish, and a job opened up a few years later and I ended up getting it. And I'm there ever since. So I oversee the programming in the parish, primarily staffing and our social justice outreach to the Supper Table, Women's Center, and we also offer other ministries as well. And then, of course, we've got the church community as well.
Yeah.
So we have a staff of about 21 right now, and I work with a really enthusiastic team of people with many gifts and many talents.
Okay, before we get into St. Joe's and what they do, why do you do what you do?
Well, when I first came to Ottawa in 2005 as a student, I was looking for a community.
Yeah. Where did you come from?
Montreal.
Okay. Originally
Montreal. Okay. And I was studying at Ottawa U in the PhD history program. And our department was right around the corner from this neo-Gothic church.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I didn't give it much thought, to be perfectly frank. I just saw that there's a church there and I went about my day.
Yeah.
But it so happened that a colleague and friend of mine in the program said, I got baptized in that church. Why don't you come with me to University Mass, which was geared towards students, and I did.
Yeah.
And I found a community ultimately that was living its faith in a very active way. That drew me in. And I don't think I ever quite saw that before. I had been involved before in my home Catholic parish, and it did good work. But this was living its faith in a quite a daring way sometimes.
When do they do University Mass for any students that may be listening out
there? So University Mass is Sunday evenings at 7 p.m. during the school year. So it runs from September to the end of April.
Okay.
And and by University Mass, we mean that it really is geared in every way to students. So we have a cantor who is a younger person. We have young people involved in the different ministries involved at Mass.
Yep.
And most of the people who attend are students at either Ottawa U or Carleton.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Beautiful. So you came from Montreal, you got involved. What keeps you going?
Well, I got involved, and what happened, of course, at St. Joe's is that when you get involved in one little aspect of the church, you get drawn into more and more and more. It's like one of those little Russian dolls. You keep opening up and something keeps coming out. And so that is sort of what happened to me. I got involved initially with the University Mass. I started running at that time a little newsletter. And then I learned more and more about the parish. And I realized that it was in many ways a very winsome sort of parish in the sense that it allowed for people's gifts to really grow. It reached out in, I think, daring ways to the community around it, to people that often were marginalized. And it also allowed me to sort of doubt and to have thoughts and to consider and debate and discuss. It was a place where you had the freedom to think. And it still is, I think, that kind of place. So a job opened up. I applied for it, and it was a very different career path than what I thought for myself. But that often happens.
Isn't it always?
It often is. Yeah. And here I am, a decade later.
Tell me about St. Joe's. I know it's got a rich history in the city of ours.
So the parish itself was founded in 1856. So it's a historic parish. Cathedral-style neo-Gothic church. It was founded by a religious order called the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and they still run it and they still own it. And that order had a mission, and still has a mission, of serving the marginalized and serving the poor. And specifically, the Oblates believe that poverty occurs in many, many ways. There are many faces to poverty. Often it's socioeconomic, but there could be other types as well. And so their mission is to not just serve the poor, but walk with the poor, journey with the poor. So at St. Joe's, that was always a bit of an ethos of that parish. Now, in the second half of the 20th century is when the church really started to move down this path of what we call the preferential option for the poor, type of social justice, a compassionate approach towards those on the margins. And it happened for a few reasons. One of them was the demographics of Sandy Hill, where St. Joe's is located, really started to change. You started to have the university buying up more properties, people moving into the suburbs. And so for the church to keep going and surviving, it had to redefine itself a little bit. And that's what started to happen in the 1970s. Now, in the 70s, there was a real movement, and you probably experienced this in your own ministry, this idea that being in ministry is reciprocal. You're ministering to people, but at the same time, in some sense, they're ministering to you. You're growing yourself in that ministry. And one of the thinkers that really sort of came up with that concept was a man called Henry Nouwen, a Catholic priest.
I love Henry Nouwen.
Yeah, and he's often used, I think, in many different types of social justice programming.
Yeah.
So one of his quotes, and this is the foundation in some way of St. Joe's, in 1972, in the book Wounded Healer, he wrote that hospitality is the virtue which allows us to break through the narrowness of our own fears and to open our houses to the stranger with the intuition that salvation comes to us in the form of a tired traveler. Anyone involved in any type of Christian outreach knows that tired traveler is a metaphor for Christ.
Yeah.
So in the 1970s, St. Joe's developed something called the hospitality ministry, and it's so tied to this concept.
Yeah.
And they were basically ordinary parishioners getting together to make sandwiches for people who came to the doors. And the priest at the time, a man called Father Fred McGee, got involved in that. But he had a problem with it. His problem was that although it was a good ministry, it wasn't inviting people into the church. It was giving them food through a window and saying goodbye. And that's, it's important. It was a good service, but he wanted to go one step further. And he was basically saying,
it sounds like COVID.
It does sound like COVID, what we're doing right now.
Right?
But what he was basically saying is that we have a duty to invite that stranger, the traveler, into our home.
Yeah.
And so he said, you know what, how do we do that? In 1978, he launched the St. Joe's Supper Table with lay parishioners as well. And so people started to dine indoors.
Yeah.
And that program grew into a more formal program. And then a few years later, he developed or helped develop the St. Joe's Women's Center. Again, that became a day program where we didn't just serve the community through a service window. People came into our church and they actually were welcomed in the building itself. So, none of this happened in isolation. It was this ethos, I think, that you started getting through Henry Nouwen of inviting people in and meeting people where they are as well.
Where they're at.
That's right.
Yeah. So, like, I was just trying to do the math while you were talking, and that's like 45 years.
Yeah,
it's been a long time.
For a ministry like this,
especially being located where they are, because as you had stated before, that downtown neighborhood or that downtown core has changed rapidly.
It has changed rapidly, and it's a very eclectic mix. I mean, the reality is, in that core neighborhood, you get students, you get people who are probably upper middle class, and it's quite expensive homes. You get shelter programs, churches, transient demographics as well. So it is very, very diverse in that sense.
Yeah, that's the whole muck. Yeah.
You really get everything, but it allows, I think, for a church community to really to live the gospel in some way as well.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so tell me about the supper program, the St. Joe's supper table.
Yeah, so at the core of the program, traditionally it was and is a dinner service.
Yeah.
Now, one thing we're more conscious of as we start developing this program is we want it to be not just food, but healthy food. And so we are conscious and intentional about serving meals that I think we'd want to be served ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we're conscious of as well is to make this more of a community dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to institutionalize people.
Mm-hmm.
Very often people that come to us have been institutionalized.
So what do you mean by that for our listeners?
So what I mean by that is we offer a small scale service.
Okay.
We don't have a large, cafeteria style dining area where you get 50 or 100 people.
The hall.
We don't do that. What we do is we invite people in basically in shifts of about 20 to 25 outside of COVID. And we have a dining area. And that dining area we've tried over the years to make hospitable. So we have a fireplace.
Yeah.
We put flowers on the table. We try to make it feel like you're actually at home. And one of the key elements of that, primarily before COVID, was our volunteer team. Our volunteers got to know by name our guests, and they would serve them, and the guests knew them. Mm-hmm. And they treated them as members of the community, not as people that were just helping. Mm-hmm. So that was certainly one element. Now, it's not a program that maybe is the best fit for everyone. So there were some people that were not comfortable coming in. And so for them, we always offered meals through a service window for takeaway, and there are some that prefer that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the core meal service. During COVID, that started to shift and develop, and we started offering a breakfast service. And we never thought we'd do that. I mean, we're the St. Joe's supper table, and here we are offering breakfast.
Well, not only that, but then it's the whole shift in your volunteers and schedules and
Well, all of a sudden, our service is now extended significantly, and we're there in the morning.
Yeah.
But we found that breakfast is incredibly popular, and we never thought that to be the case. And I think it's because people wake up, it's an important meal of the day. And one thing we need to point out is that people who come to the supper table are not primarily homeless. There are homeless too. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are working poor. In some cases, they're immigrants. We have pensioners coming, small pensioners with limited incomes. And so the breakfast service became really popular. And part of it was that we customize it. So when you come to the window to get a breakfast, you don't just sort of get food slapped onto a plate or into a tray. We kind of ask you, what do you want? And we see if we have what you'd like and if we're able to serve it to you. So it's customized, and there's a human face to the service, I think. So that's kind of the core of the meal service. But attached to the supper table, we do also offer food bank services. And that has been quite important, I think, to the community. There are two different food bank services serving very different demographics. One of them is in our building. It's on site, and it serves primarily single people, in some cases couples, in our immediate area. But there was also a real need off-site in a community housing area of the city in Strathcona Heights.
Yes.
And so what we do there...
that's just right around the corner.
It's not far from us at all. So we now operate a satellite location. And in that food bank, we are serving mainly families, and very, very often families with young children. So again, a very different demographic to be serving at that point. We also, last year in particular, ran a breakfast snack program where we handed out boxes, and in the box you'd have a collection of healthy snacks and breakfast items for primarily families with school-aged children, and that was something that was quite popular as well.
When did you start the Strathcona Food Bank?
It's been about 7 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. And attached to the food banks, there was a real need as well to start thinking about this idea of a community garden. And so one of the previous managers of our supper table program, this was very much her idea, Mary Murphy, she decided that, let's use the land around the church and develop a community garden.
Yep.
And so we did. And what that means is in the summer, our soup kitchen and our food bank has access to herbs, fresh vegetables. Yep. And it also does one other thing as well. One of the things that we realize is people, when they have to stand in line outside for food, it can be a very sort of objectifying experience. People are watching you when you walk by, and Laurier Street, where we're located, is a busy street. And so by having the garden, having flowers and plants, it takes the attention away from people who are waiting for meals. And people walking by see, I think, the beauty of that garden. And people who come to our services, people who are guests, have commented and said they feel less self-conscious.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Because they're in an environment that is welcoming, and that, you know, the attention is not on their hardship. The attention is on this living garden that we have around us. And it is also a garden where there's places to sit. And so our guests are able to use it in that way as well.
Yeah.
So those are the core elements. Now, you know, one thing that we realize is that food is essential. It's critical, but it's not the only thing. It's the fundamental service we offer. But if we're going to really live our mission, we have to do more than that. We have to look at the idea of dignity. And in some cases, I think helping to restore dignity as well. So what are programs we can start offering that are not strictly food related? Well, we started doing things like art therapy. We started doing things like Christian meditation. And we realized that there's a need and a desire for that in our community among the guests. Because although, you know, food is critical, people want more. People often want to feel that they have a human connection. And one way to do it is through these sorts of programs.
And food's just, you know, just the beginning. If you know, when you were saying that pensioners come and grab a meal, and I can understand that because they don't have a lot of disposable income. And I think that, you know, as we have moved through this pandemic, we've seen those cracks in the social gaps become even wider. And so I guess the big question to me is, give me a good idea how many people you're serving.
Yeah. So right now, so pre-pandemic, traditionally,
not that numbers matter.
Yeah. But they're useful to know, and they're interesting, I think.
Yeah.
So pre-pandemic, typically we would serve between 70 to 100 people a day for dinner, 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. During the pandemic, it's changed. We're offering takeaway meals. And what that looks like is breakfast, typically, I'd say about 30 breakfasts, and then dinner, probably about 40 to 50. Yeah. So we're serving roughly the same number of meals, but it's spread out more. And I think what that means is, in some sense, maybe we should have been doing this before the pandemic, right? Because we're meeting people where they are. Not everyone wants to come for dinner. Some find breakfast more valuable.
Yeah, and that goes back to meeting people where they're at, right?
Yeah.
And that changes as society changes, as things. I hate to say the word because I hate using it in COVID. We've used it so many times. As things pivot and as we pivot on how we provide services, in retrospect, we're pivoting because of the populations that we're serving. Right. We
are. And the reality is we never probably, you know, before COVID, I don't think we ever did a very comprehensive survey to say, what we're offering, does it meet your needs? We didn't really do that. COVID forced us to do that. And it forced us to reflect and say, you know, are we still meeting the needs of people in our community? And I think what we realize now is meals that are customized, that are really customized to the individual's needs. If we're able to offer it, that's what we should continue to offer. So our hope certainly at this point is to continue, even beyond COVID, trying to offer that breakfast program and the dinner program and serving a more diverse clientele.
How has the past 2 years been with your volunteers?
Difficult. Difficult because a lot of our volunteers have been there for decades in some cases, and they're older. And the reality is that in the middle of the pandemic, especially when we didn't know what direction it was taking, having volunteers work in close quarters with guests wasn't a good idea. And so we had to move away from the volunteer model, especially for the first, I'd say, year and a half of the pandemic. We're trying to move back to that now. But again, keeping in mind that we're still in this period of flux.
So when you say you had to move away from the volunteer model, what does that mean?
So what it means is that before the pandemic, we had 70 volunteers working throughout the week.
Yeah.
So a huge volunteer base, which resulted in a lot of coordination.
And if to any of our listeners, 70 volunteers is a lot.
It's a lot
to manage and keep contact with and coordinate and
I think, you know, also continue offering meaningful opportunities for them, right? Because the worst thing you want to do is to get into this rut
and the engagement that you and I were talking pre-show, right?
Sure.
Keeping not only ourselves engaged but also engaged with our volunteers.
It really is exceptionally difficult. So with COVID, from one day to the next, that had to stop, and we had to move away from in-person meals to offering takeaways. So what that meant is we had to move more towards a paid staff model. Now, We've always had a manager, a paid full-time staff person, and depending on her ability to get grants, we would have an assistant, a part-time assistant. In this model right now, we've been fortunate to get different types of grants and have our paid manager as well as multiple paid part-time assistants.
Yeah.
And we've been able to continue the meal service
just
in that
to
model.
Keep the cogs in the wheel turning.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, once we return to in-person meals, in-person dining, we do have to start bringing back our volunteer base. But one of the challenges is going to be, training, because the reality is 2 years have passed, and our method of operating is not quite the same as what it was. We've learned things as well. So offering volunteers formation is going to be critical. Engaging new volunteers is going to be quite important. Unfortunately, over the 2 years, we had some volunteers have passed away as well. They were older demographics. And so I think rebuilding that base is going to be the challenge moving forward, and rethinking it as well.
I guess the next kind of idea that comes to my mind, or thought that comes to my mind, is how do you go about recruiting younger volunteers?
So there's a couple of options that we have and that have worked in the past. One of them is we have our university mass community, right? So students are, it's a wonderful demographic to tap into. Now, the challenge with students is that it is a more transient demographic, which means they may not be here long term. Their classes change every semester, the schedules change. And so can they really commit to, a full year always doing the same shift? Probably not. The other demographic that has worked for us is we have an interesting partnership with a group called the Christian Reformed Chaplaincy, and they rent space actually in our rectory, in our building. And a lot of young people participate in that, and they've provided us with volunteers as well, younger volunteers. And so that's been great. The other demographic that has helped out over the years is what we call the secular Franciscans. These are lay people that are involved with the Franciscan community. And they've taken on a service in the supper table where they offer once a month a brunch on a Saturday morning. And that's been a great and a very diverse way of offering a new type of service, and also engaging a very different community. People who maybe wouldn't otherwise be engaged directly with the supper table are now offering this service and finding meaning, I think, in offering that program.
Tell me a bit more about the garden. How big is it?
So it's not particularly big. I mean, consider it this way. We're in the middle of the downtown.
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
So we have we've got a rectory. The rectory is where the priests used to live, and it's where offices are now located. And all around it, we do have sort of a smaller garden, and we've got lifted garden beds.
Yes.
And we focus primarily on herbs and vegetables at this point. And so the vegetables have been traditionally tomatoes and lettuce were big. And we've also had kale. We would have lots of different types of herbs we would use in our cooking. And that would be the focus essentially. So it's not a wide variety, but it's the things we traditionally use.
Yeah. Well, it got me thinking, because Jericho Road, we started a garden last year. And so we had a donor up in North Gore who was very familiar with our program and really liked what we were doing. And so we used to go up and help him. He had a vineyard. A big 20-acre piece of land, and he was growing grapes. Now, I know I can say this in jest because I know him very well, but all the farmers around there thought he was crazy growing grapes for wine, but it was a hobby of his. And so we would go up and help him. The guys from the discipleship house go up and pick grapes or cover the grapes and whatnot. And it was always very ironic. We thought that men who are in a treatment program would be up helping this gentleman make wine, but it worked out very good because it gave the man really good experience and learning about farming and cultivation. And not only that, but it was a really good experience for them to work together as a team. And so last year we decided that we would take it a little step further, because he really wanted to give something back to our community. So at the end of his winery, he had a huge plot of land, and so we tilled it, fertilized it, and we grew potatoes, carrots, and onions. And so what we were planning on doing was just growing enough to sustain the houses at Jericho Road throughout the winter with fresh onions, potatoes, and carrots. Now, this being our first year, we learned a few lessons. That God was in charge, because we planted carrots too early, and all the little seedlings, we had a frost, and so it wiped out all the carrots. But then the other side of that was that we had such a beautiful harvest of potatoes and onions that we were able to help out other communities around here. And so we gave some to the food bank. And what was the other one? Was it St. Joe's or St. Luke's? Can't remember. Anyways, we were able to spread some of the bounty around. So when I was reading that you guys had the community garden, I thought that was just wonderful.
And that's wonderful. The nice thing about that is even during the pandemic, that has remained volunteer run. So volunteers have continued to take the initiative. They would come and they would really focus on that. We had some of our guests involved in it as well, but primarily volunteers from our parish would be the ones participating in that and running it even in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So I was really quite happy and kind of elated to see that you were doing that. Let's move on to the Women's Center, because I want to know what's going on with St. Joe's and the Women's Center that you're operating.
Yeah, so the St. Joe's Women's Center, again, kind of came about roughly around the same time as the supper table. It's a little bit newer.
Okay.
So we're looking at 1983, a group of volunteers started offering a breakfast service, and they offered it to about 20 women. And the women were living essentially in a temporary homeless shelter that was run out of All Saints Anglican Church in our neighborhood.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, now they no longer exist anymore.
Yes.
But it was a makeshift center. And of course, what that meant is that they couldn't stay there during the day. They were sort of wandering the streets. And there was a desire, to offer breakfast, but then shouldn't they also have a place to stay during the day? And so St. Joe's started looking at offering a day program, a day shelter to these women. And in 1984, so about a year after it got off the ground, they started doing exactly that. They transformed the basement of our rectory a few years after that into a day program, and it involved fairly significant renovations as well. At that point, putting in a kitchen, putting in office space. And they began basically, offering this service. But what's worthwhile noting is that initially they were really working on a shoestring budget.
Yeah.
Like I think, from what I recall in the history books, $500 a month was what they had to operate with in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Now, granted, 1980s,
$1980, but still
500. You don't get a lot for that.
Yeah.
And that's really what they had. And so initially, what were they offering? They were offering a breakfast. They were offering programming like, for example, how to quilt.
Yeah.
How to make crafts, things that would put women in a positive space. And in 1989, they finally tapped into some municipal funding and they created a permanent space. And they started building the program. And at that point, they were able to start hiring staff.
Yeah.
And so you move in this direction of something that starts as a passionate project of a small group of volunteers or even one person, moving ultimately in the direction of having a professional staff team running it. And so what we have today is a City of Ottawa funded program. So we're very fortunate to get generous funding from the city.
Wonderful.
We have full-time staff, and we offer breakfast and lunch and a food cupboard program, as well as a shower facility, laundry facility, computers. And we also have generally once a month a public health nurse that comes by and is available.
Yeah.
We have connections with Royal Ottawa, for instance, so we do try to maintain that. We do a certain amount of case management work as well. And then on top of that, we try to branch out and also serve the young children of the women, including boys up to a certain age. And so in the past, what that would mean is we would, for instance, in the summer, take the women to for outings. We would take them to Mont Cascade Water Park. In the summer, we would pay for summer camps in some cases. And that includes also sending children with special needs to specialized summer camps. And that, I think, has made quite a bit of a difference. There's been a lot of work done with refugee families as well in the Women's Center. And the Women's Center has worked in the area of anti-human trafficking.
Yes.
And has worked with the RCMP on that.
Very important.
So it's it offers a wide range of services at this point. And fortunately, it's continued to operate for most of the pandemic in person to the extent possible.
That you can,
Yeah, so, a limited number of people can come in, but we are open. People can eat meals on site, can use our services. And the reality is, seemingly small things like a laundry facility, a shower facility, if you're living on the streets, that's
huge.
It's pretty essential.
Yeah.
And again,
in a safe environment.
A safe, non-institutional environment. Again, when you walk in there, it's a welcoming space. There are flowers, there's art on the wall. It's the place where you feel, I think, at home versus feeling that you're part of some sort of endless big institution and just a number.
Yeah.
And we have some clients that have come for a number of years and the staff know them well. They're comfortable there. And again, a wide range of demographics. By no means are they all homeless. In fact, many of them are not. But they're coming there for community. And I think one thing we often forget about is loneliness is a form of poverty.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people that are alienated and lonely in our society. And
spiritual poverty.
And spiritual poverty.
Yeah.
So having a space that is safe, that they could come to, where they feel like they're part of a family is important.
Yeah. I was talking to someone the other day and we were talking about homelessness in this city. And how we really have to take a different lens when we talk about homelessness, because there are so many people that are on the verge of homelessness, and how our social network gaps have become wider, as we were stating before, but how people are relying more and more on the services that people like you are providing.
I should share a little bit of a mini story or anecdote. Often the work we do surprises me. I meet people that I don't expect to meet using our services. One day, a couple of summers ago before the pandemic, an very elderly woman in her 80s, a nun, showed up, and she came with a suitcase. And she said she's coming from Montreal and that she's here to start a new branch of her congregation in Ottawa, which is a strange sort of thing to hear. She was, in her late 80s. And she showed up with a suitcase and she said, I'm here and churches have always been sanctuaries. Can you give me something to eat? I haven't had anything to eat. I don't have anywhere to go for the rest of the day. I think I have housing in the evening, but I've got nowhere to go. And this is a woman in her late 80s. And so I was stunned, first of all, that we're serving her, but she came in. And so we gave her food, and her immediate response was, well, I'm so thankful for you giving me food, but I also want to help out. I want to be able to give back. And so she started preparing sandwiches in our supper table program. And then she went and she sat in the library and read, and she spent the entire day there. Now, meanwhile, we called her congregation in Montreal to say, just so you know, do you know that this is happening? And immediately they said, thank you so much for letting us know. We're sending a car to get her back. And they did, and they picked her up. 2 weeks after that, I got a letter in the mail from her, handwritten letter with a $20 bill. And she said, the $20 is to help your supper table program. I really appreciate the food you gave me and the welcoming and the hospitality. And thank you for being a sanctuary. And we forget that churches are traditionally sanctuary programs. That's what we were always historically. When you look at the downtown area, someone like that, and other people too, where would they really go to if not to a church that has open doors? You could show up at the University of Ottawa campus, but who are you going to meat? Who's going to really reach out to you and help with a story like that? So I think that one of the critical things for us to recall is that particularly if you're a church-based program, remember that churches historically have always been sanctuaries, and think about your ministry in that way.
Yeah, that's really good, really good. How many people are you serving at the Women's Center? Give us a little.
So the Women's Center, right now, I'd say on average, we get about 40 clients a day or so over the course of breakfast and lunch and the various programs we offer. That would have been more before the pandemic. We actually, just this week, we had a International Women's Day lunch. It was the first time we reopened our parish hall, and we had close to 70 people present. It was actually in partnership with The Well, which is an Anglican service in the downtown. And they came and helped us with that. And it was a lunch program with gift bags and with prizes. It was something I think the women really appreciated. We would also hold events. One of the events we hold each year is called Quality of Life. And we recognize someone in the Ottawa community who's really given back to the community and helped people who are marginalized. And we also invite some of our clients to that event as well. So they get to participate, and many of them are often introduced. And so it's one way for Ottawa to come together and see how the Women's Center is reaching out and how other people could perhaps join that mission in different ways.
Well, that's just a beautiful lead in to what I want to talk about next. Why is it so hard for community services like St. Joe's, Jericho Road? I mean, there's so many. Why is it so hard for us to communicate with one another?
Well, it shouldn't be, but I think the reason why it's hard, the answer comes to my mind is that we're all really busy.
Yes.
The reality is
that's the juggle ball, right? We're always juggling the balls.
We are. And the reality is that I'd love to do more bridge building. In fact, when I came into this role, I said that's one of the things I really want to do is to build bridges, build connections. Yeah. But then you get involved in the daily grind, and you can easily lose sight. Yeah. So one of our challenges, how do we balance that to make sure that we are, one, serving our populations and running a good program, but also trying to build those bridges? Yeah, because ultimately, and that's why we kind of started this podcast, because, just what you said, one of the things in my head was we got to start getting connected to everybody, because Our mission is to serve, the people that need us the most. Mm-hmm. And so we can only serve them better if we're communicating with one another, and we're talking to one another, and we're trying to help out each other to make that common goal, I guess, the outcome even more better than each individual of trying to do it individually. Yeah, and the reality is we should be sharing resources. So
yes,
what that means in practice.
I'm always nervous to say that.
Why?
Because you don't. I think part of the problem in taking down the silos between all of us agencies and people that are doing good work, faith communities and whatnot, is that we're afraid of losing something.
Yeah, so we develop a fiefdom mentality.
That's right.
We each have our little fiefdom.
Yes,
but that's not healthy. And the reality is that when we share resources, what am I talking about? I'm talking about things like, for instance, if I know that Jericho Road offers a wonderful recovery program, and I meet someone in the supper table who is in need of that, then I know exactly where to send them.
Yes.
And say, you know what, let's put you in touch with Jericho Road. If Jericho Road finds someone,
and that's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
And you would do the same thing.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we were just talking before the show, the difficulties, for instance, of staffing and volunteers and hiring and things like that. Yeah. Well, the reality is, what a wonderful opportunity if Jericho Road has someone who is looking for a career path, and we happen to be offering a position that is a good fit. Well, of course you would share that with us, and I would with you as well.
Yeah.
So there's another opportunity, and these are ways to break down those silos.
And the resources are more than just what we think resources are. A, money, B, tangible material assets or whatnot, right? It's more than that.
It's much more than that. I mean, those are important too. I mean, if for instance, well, I'll give you an example. We ended up getting these large deliveries of breakfast boxes, and in reality, it was more than our community really needed. Yeah. If we have those connections, we know who to reach out to and say, hey, we've got 20 breakfast boxes. Can you use them? Why not share those? Now, that makes perfect sense, I think, to share that.
We found that with our farm project this summer, or I should say last summer, because I mean, when we reached out to a couple of service agencies thinking, that maybe they would want some fresh potatoes, I thought that it would be a little bit more difficult than it was. And it wasn't. Yeah. It was very simple when we reached out to these agencies.
Well, and to be frank, it was even simple with you. It was, I think, in the fall, we had these breakfast boxes. And I think I contacted one of your staff, Amy, I believe. And I said, look, we have these boxes. Would you like them? And she said, absolutely, we can use them. So I drove them over. Yeah. And it's that simple.
Yeah. And so what can we do to start facilitating those connections?
I think start talking.
Yeah.
So you're doing that here.
Yeah.
But I think one option would be, which we really need, is what if there would be developing some kind of a working group. It doesn't have to meet too regularly, but there's an opportunity, a forum where we come together at certain times of the year and we just see where is everyone at.
Yeah.
I think that is not a hard thing to develop. And I would also say that there's a natural connection between groups that have some sort of faith dimension, I think, and it doesn't have to, it could be any denomination, frankly, and it could be other faiths too. I should mention that, we've had a wonderful connection with the Muslim community. In the supper table, they provided us meals regularly before the pandemic, twice a month. And so, developing that forum where we could actually get together and talk is an easy way.
One of the first guests we had on this podcast was Kate Saunderson from A Place to Go at St. Peter and St. Paul's Church. And she kind of basically just said what you said, because we were talking about the same thing, because I ask all my guests that question, because we got to start getting connected. And she said, we need to have a big dinner. We need to get all of us together and sit down and have some food, and not necessarily have an agenda, but let's just start talking.
that is always the basic way to break down boundaries, is to share a meal.
Oh, love it.
Right. And the reality is, and the nice thing is, who shares that? Jewish community shares that, the Muslim community, and the Christian community shares that. It's part of our culture. And the reality is, all these faiths developed in a part of the world, the Middle East, where sharing a meal was critically important.
Yeah. So, especially if it's a buffet.
Especially if it's a buffet. And you know, the nice thing is, for us, I think you're right. The worst thing to do would be go into a meeting like this and say, here's the agenda, here are our talking points. Yeah. Start it off with building community.
That's right. Yeah. The connection. Yeah. Right. Yeah. How do you think that our faith feeds into the services that you provide?
Well, I think in a few ways. So if we share a Christian faith, a Catholic faith, one of the aspects of that is that we are called to actually be present and walk with people, and we're called to see Christ in the other. That is one of the most critical things. And if that's how we approach someone else, and particularly if we approach someone who is homeless, someone who is struggling, someone who may be pretty difficult to get along with sometimes, someone who is having mental health issues, and we don't see them for their struggles and their failings, but we see them for the dignity that they have, the intrinsic dignity, then our service is going to be, I think, a lot more meaningful, and it's going to help restore some of the dignity that's been lost. I think the worst thing for us to do probably is to lose sight of that faith dimension and component, and that faith dimension calls us to do more than just give temporal aid. We're not simply here to provide people basic survival from one day to the next. I mean, that's obviously important. Those meals are important, but that's the bare minimum. Yeah. We're sort of at the bottom of the barrel if we stop at only that. Yeah. I think our goal really is to see the human in the other person, and see Christ in the other person. Yeah.
One of the things that we would like to talk about, and I think it's really important, is that people who require the services that we're providing, it's not just the single service that we're providing, and we have to understand that. One of the things that we really understand at Jericho Road is that people just don't wake up and say, I'm going to be an alcoholic, or I'm going to be a drug addict today. People don't wake up and say, I don't want to have a home today, right? And so we have to understand what got people to that point.
And you know, understanding that one way to do it is by offering a pastoral approach. Yes. And pastoral care in particular is an area that I think is maybe undervalued in society. It's not counseling as such, but what it is listening. Listening. Right? Really, that's really what it is, listening actively. Yeah. And if someone comes in who is, you know, on the streets, has experienced trauma, maybe is struggling with addiction as well, one of the things that probably has happened over the years is that he or she has not been heard at all by anyone. So imagine the life-giving moment that person walks into a building, meets a stranger, and that stranger sits down and genuinely listens. You know, that's something that I hate to use the word priceless because it's used so often, but in some sense it is. You can't really put a price on that. It's extremely different than going into a professional's office, as important as that is. You're sitting down with another human, another vulnerable human, who is simply listening to you, and you're the one who has maybe never been heard. Yeah,
I remember, you know, having a client at Jericho Road, and he was very angry, and he was yelling and screaming, and after, you know, he had calmed down, I asked him, I said, you know, like, what's really going on? And he said, I just want to be heard. You know, that always stuck in my head. Yeah.
Well, and we've had people, you know, being where we are located on our property, people who are really struggling with mental health crises, and they're not getting the help they need. And what ends up happening is they may be living in a shelter. They're effectively not able to stay there during the day, so they're roaming the streets.
That's right.
And very often what it ends up being is they're just looking for some kind of connection. Yeah. And initially, that initial connection isn't always an easy one, because they're maybe suspicious, for one. Yeah. They've not been treated particularly well. Yeah. And so when you approach them, and this has happened to me, their initial response is to be a little bit standoffish. But I think if they sense that your intentions are good, and that you're not, you know, you're not coming with any ulterior motive, you're simply coming to listen and say, what can we do for you? Yeah. And there's no catch. Yeah. Once they realize that, I think the dynamic changes, and I've certainly seen that in our church.
Yeah. Well, I would say, you know, you try living in survival mode, for 30 or more days and see how your trust levels are with other people.
And that's, I think, what's hard for us to understand.
Well,
I mean,
that's just it, right?
The reality is, I think about this often. We have people that come to our church, and they just come just to be warm in the winter.
Yeah.
And as staff, we're in a position of having to close the doors at some point and tell them, you're going to have to leave.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to say,
Of
but
course.
we do it. So I go home to my warm house. I have a nice meal. I can watch Netflix at home and read. And I wake up the next morning and I'm feeling okay. And I'm thinking, geez, how frustrated would I be if I don't have any of that? And if I'm struggling to find a public toilet, constantly.
Yeah.
And you think during the pandemic, how difficult that's been.
Yeah.
The reality is public institutions have been closed, have been limited. And so people are on the streets and they're not able to access the most basic services.
Yeah. And those basic services that are not only not accessible, but sometimes not even available, right? And I think that a lot of the misinformation that we have, especially when it comes to shelters and people who are providing those services, I think that the mass population doesn't understand that if you're staying at, let's say, the Mission, you have a bed for the night, but then at 8 a.m, you got to go.
Yep.
It's not a home. It's
not
supposed to be a temporary a place for you to not freeze outside or have some security so that,
And what happens when you're living in that condition for years?
Well, and that's just it, right? Yeah. It's supposed to be temporary.
Yeah.
And yet, from talking to many people, from doing what I do, they say I'm living at the Mission. Well, no one should be living at the Mission.
No, it's not a place to live
at
all.
It's not a place to live.
And unfortunately, sometimes when you live there, you're in an environment where the problems that you're experiencing are perpetuated and are exacerbated as well.
Yeah.
You see that a lot. One of the things that I'm surprised about is that how much of suffering in society goes unnoticed and undetected because it's happening quietly. Because the reality is people are often, they don't share it. They're not proud of it. They're often ashamed of it.
And we don't want to see it.
And we don't want to see it. And the reality is, who are you going to talk to about it? I mean, you go into a store and we automatically ask each other in a perfunctory way, how are you? I'm fine.
Yeah.
We don't expect to know more than that, right? We're fine, move on. I had outside of St. Joe's, where I live, I had a young man who was coming asking if he could do some work on the various condos on our property, and he came to me as well, and we started talking, and it turned out that he was a Catholic, and he started talking about that. And very quickly I learned that he was living in his car and for weeks on end. And,
oh my goodness.
And he shared that with me essentially in the most sort of passing way. It was just to say, by the way, I'm just living in my car. It was nothing to him. It was it had become a normal way of life.
Yeah.
And that's when it hit me that, there are a lot of people out there that are suffering in that way, and we just don't hear about it.
Yeah. And so as a society, where do you think we have to start to address these issues?
Well, I think we have to be able to the word we often use in a church environment is be prophetic. And the idea is that be daring, go out, and in your own community, when you see instances of that kind of suffering, see what you're able to do individually, and then also are you able to get involved in a group, a community group that's addressing some of those issues. So to engage and not close our eyes. It's really easy for us to put blinders on. I have a car, I have a comfortable home, I have my weekend routine, my evening routine. If we break out of our comfort zone and open our eyes to what actually is happening in our neighborhood and further afield, that's the first place to start, I think.
Yeah, and not to be a dreary Dan, but as our municipality, our province, our federal system, as they continue to pull back on the services, the essential social services that people need, it's falling into our laps.
It is.
And we have to do something.
Yeah. Now, of course, that's a long tradition.
Yes.
Because the reality is, look at the services that are available in the downtown. How many of them have started in churches or religious groups?
Yeah.
Virtually all of them. Yeah. Almost all of them have. So that's nothing new that churches have stepped in to fill the gap. And part of the reason I think is that there's that sense of mission. There's the understanding that we have to live our faith in an active way. So it's natural for us to want to do that, I think, on some level. We also have something to offer that goes beyond just that meal. It's the idea that we need to make that human connection. And I think, making it with anyone, not just someone who is close to us in terms of their own faith life, someone with no faith life, someone who's of a different faith. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The reality is to see the really, in some way, the divine in everyone. And I think churches can be well positioned to do that, and often have.
Have you ever heard of the halo effect?
I've heard of it, but don't know much about it.
So the halo effect says that for every dollar you give a nonprofit, a ministry, an NGO, so to speak, it's worth about $7 to the municipality, because we're able to provide services, needed services, much more efficient, much more beneficial, and much more without red tape, so to speak, than what the government services or government agencies can do.
Well, the reality is that I think we all work in a pretty frugal way. We have limited means, and we're used to it.
Yeah,
right?
The old executive director of Jericho Road, Hope, God bless her, she used to say, "We're very scrappy."
Yeah.
Right?
We
We do a lot with very little.
With very little. We're used to the shoestring budget kind of approach to things, and we're aware of that. The other thing, too, is that we don't have the red tape, as you were saying, so we're more flexible to respond quickly. I think if you're a government agency offering these services, it's hard to pivot and change rapidly because you
have to do 10 studies.
You do studies and measurables and deliverables and whatever else. If you're working out of a basement of a church and you say, you know what, we need to rethink this, you just rethink it. You do it. The other aspect as well, I think, is that there are a lot of partnerships between public and private sectors. So, for instance, at St. Joe's, as I mentioned, we do get money from the city of Ottawa. But although that's an important source of funding, we also collect money from our parishioners through Sunday offerings. And the reality is that every faith community, I think, is open to that. People realize that being part of a community means you do give back. And if you have the means, you help. You help these services. I think the fact that there's already an active community there means that there's more dimension to the social service we're offering. Yeah,
and we understand that completely here.
I bet.
Okay. Before we go, I just wanted to know if you had any personal stories that you wanted to share, something that has touched you and keeps you going in what you do, or something that you always remember in your head.
Yeah, I think I remember one instance where someone I think was in a little bit of distress, and he was a guest or a client of the supper table program, but he wasn't looking for food, really. He was simply looking for someone to pray with him. Now, I have to say that doesn't come naturally to me, and it's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? But
no.
What I mean is that I very much come from a church culture, I think, from my family as well, where prayer is a very private kind of thing, and you do it on your own, and I'm not accustomed to, praying with someone or leading that prayer.
Yeah.
But what he was asking is, he said, well, first I want to talk and tell you about what I'm going through. I said, great, I can do that. I can listen. I'd like to do that. So he came to my office and we sat, and then he said, really what I think would be meaningful for me is I'd like you to pray for me right here. And I'm not accustomed to that at all. Yeah. So initially I went, I started with the Our Father, which is the typical kind of Catholic go-to prayer, I think. Yeah. But then I became a little bit more comfortable listening to him and praying with him and finding out, what do you want me to pray for? And let's pray together. And what does prayer mean to you, first of all? What do you think when it comes to prayer? And as we were talking, one of the things he shared with me is that he was concerned that, he wasn't sort of praying right. He wasn't praying enough. And that ultimately, he wasn't doing a good job as someone who's leading a faith life and trying to reach God and pray. And I didn't initially know what to say to that. But then I thought, and I said, some of the things that you're praying for, that you're telling me, are things that you're struggling with, and you're praying for others in your immediate circle who are struggling and who you care about. Yeah. Well, that care that you're demonstrating, that worry that you're telling me about someone else, that's your prayer. At the end of the day, what is prayer? Prayer is living. It's life. It's the genuine concern for the other, for ourselves, for our relationships. And even though it may not be a formal prayer that you're coming up with, the fact that you're actually genuinely concerned, that's the prayer.
Yeah. End of story.
End of story.
Wow. That's wonderful. That's a good one to end up on. Thank you, brother.
Thank you so much.
I told you the hour would go by quick.
It went by very quickly, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Now, normally we do some announcements and we have a question and answer period, but since we're not live, we're pre-recorded. We don't have that opportunity. So I'll just go into my announcements. Our next Voices of Recovery episode is on March 24th. where we'll be chatting with someone from the community in recovery. And normally I don't do this, but I'm really excited. So I'll give you a sneak peek. On April 7th, we have Lisa Fabian, from the Bethel Care Center, as we continue to connect and make amazing connections in this city like we did tonight. The Recovery Connection podcast, as I stated before, will be on a week from today after our wonderful producer, John, cleans it all up. And although I think tonight there's not much to clean up. That's how professional we were.
I hope it was okay.
I think so.
Good.
Okay. And for more information or to donate to St. Joe's, go to their website. I'll say it out loud, www.stjosephs.ca, and give them a shout if you need to. Their phone number is 613-233-4095. I'll repeat that one more time because we all need help in this time, especially after COVID, because we're not through it. We're still pivoting, right? You and I were having a conversation before we got on air about masks coming off and what we're going to do and how we're going to try to respect everybody's comfort zones. And I
think we'll be living with this for some time.
I think so. So see their website, www.stjosephs.ca. And Chris, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Seriously,
I appreciate it.
I'm you had reached out to Amy last fall, and then you reached out to me about a month ago, and so I'm hoping that this conversation continues, and I'm hoping that one of these days I'm going to get down to St. Joe's and see the wonderful work that you're doing.
Well, we'd love to have you, and I think this is the way we start sowing seeds.
Yeah. Will you feed me?
Absolutely.
Fabulous. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and sorry for the technical difficulties tonight. But it's always great. It's pre-recorded, our first pre-recorded. So you made history, right?
Wonderful.
Yeah. And look for our podcast next Thursday on all your favorite podcast platforms. My favorite, Spotify, not to give them any endorsement, but geez, they do a wonderful job. Thank you, brother.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. God bless you all, each and every one of you.